Go live.
All right, hi everyone. Welcome to today's live stream. Today we're going to talk about whether or not you need to claim high salary as a criterion. And this is a question that I've seen come up a lot more often. I think people are kind of under the assumption right now that you have to claim this one and you have to win this one in order to have a strong case, particularly people who are filing industry cases. I will say this isn't usually a question that comes up for academics. It's not a question that comes up for artists or athletes or anything like that. I don't know that I've ever really argued high salary in most of those contexts. I have for some academics, but only if they were receiving like some really extraordinary compensation for some other collaboration or partnership, usually with industry. But in industry, high salary is something to consider because a lot of the criteria are geared more towards academics, like authorship, judge, membership, all of those. But salary is one of those that's geared towards industry. So it can be a competitive advantage, and it's something that is claimed in a lot of cases. I've taken a look at all of my industry cases for EB-1A, and I think it's about a 50-50 split. So we'll claim high salary in about 50% of cases, and then we will not claim it at all in the other 50% of industry cases. High salary offers an advantage to those of you who are working at big companies, who have lots and lots of experience, but who haven't really done a lot of industry participation. If you can get leading critical role plus high salary, that's 2 out of 3 criteria. So that gives you a huge head start. Whereas if you can only claim leading critical role and you don't have high salary and you're working in industry and you don't have the professional participation, it is a little bit more of a hurdle to do the profile building. And so if you can claim it, definitely use it, leverage it, and all of that. But I've also worked with people who have the kinds of jobs where they probably could make more money, but they're not making more money, sometimes because they're stuck due to visa status and sponsorship issues. It's not going to negatively impact your case as long as you can claim other criteria to make up for it. I will say a lot of people who don't claim high salary in their EB-1A come back to me after their case is approved and after they get their green card, and they've gotten a huge job change, a huge promotion. It's almost like getting that immigration piece taken care of frees them to go and do what they want in the market. It frees them to go find those higher level jobs with the higher compensation and all of that. So I think people shouldn't really underestimate how trapped immigrants can feel in the system. And EB-1A can really help in solving that because you can get permanent residence on your own. And that does impact the salary criterion quite a bit. Just a random observation, it's not really related to profile building or anything, but I have always found that to be interesting. Because most of the time when I do file EB-1A cases, the person is truly extraordinary and is at the top of their field. And so getting that compensation shouldn't necessarily be an issue. It's just we can't always claim it. And that's fine. You don't need to claim it. We'll open it up to questions. I'll get into more of the details, though, about high salary. I just want to remind everyone that USCIS will either consider this criterion to be met if you have a high salary in comparison to others in your field, or significantly higher remuneration compared to others in your field. And a lot of officers will take this to mean high salary means base salary, and higher or significantly higher remuneration means total comp. So stocks, bonuses, and all of that. There's no requirement that salary means base salary in the regulations. So sometimes you can use your W-2 to claim high salary, even if it includes some bonus or some other cash compensation. You can use all kinds of creative compensation arrangements. I've seen this a lot with entrepreneurs. Sometimes they have to make an argument, even though it's not base salary, it should still be considered under salary and not under remuneration. You really do need to be making at the 90th percentile or above in your field to be able to claim high salary. And it really should be high base salary if you want a really strong argument. Again, it's not a requirement. You don't have to meet certain benchmarks. You can always make an argument based on what you have and based on other salary reports and documentation that you pull into the file. But it is safest, and you're nearly guaranteed to get the high salary criterion if you're above the 90th percentile with base salary alone, compared to the Bureau of Labor Statistics for an appropriate SOC code. For significantly high remuneration, just keep in mind, USCIS questions this all the time. Like, I have had this questioned when the person made over $1 million in compensation in a year. And it's clearly top of the field in any field. But USCIS was saying that essentially, since this person couldn't prove that they were among the top paid people in the field, like a list of names of the few people who were top paid in the field, that they weren't going to grant the high salary criterion. So officers can be unreasonable sometimes. For total comp, I've argued, $320,000 for an IT position. I think it's a lot stronger if we can argue more than $500,000 in annual comp for an IT position. But that's just the total remuneration argument. For the vast majority of cases where I'm claiming the salary criterion, I am using base salary compared to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, even though it's a lower number than the total comp number. All right, we have questions, I think.
Yeah, GNM asks, how can someone show high salary and working on a startup as a co-founder, having paid in just equity initially?
Yeah, so USCIS has released some favorable, memos and guidance over the years that say that startup founders can use equity in the consideration here. You can't just show that you have significant equity. Like, if you own more than 50% of the business, obviously it's a high number of shares, but you do need to show the value of that equity. So some people will provide actual valuation statements where they retain a third-party firm to confirm how much their equity is worth. And that can be something that is persuasive under the total remuneration argument. Sometimes this is easy to do if the startup just raised a round of funding, and so that kind of valuation is kind of baked in already. Or if the company has been acquired, you can show past remuneration for services, and that's a really powerful argument as well, especially if you sell for a large amount of money and you get a huge paycheck at that time. You have to be creative because USCIS hasn't confirmed exactly what documentation they require or what arrangements they would require or the level of the value of the equity. So again, you're always making comparisons within your field of expertise. But if you have a substantially high valuation, and you've seen some success in the business, you should be able to make an argument here.
Rakesh asks, can we include the value of benefits the company provide as part of the compensation?
Not usually. I mean, you could if you're arguing total remuneration is significantly high, if the company is giving you some really extraordinary benefits. Like if they give you residency in $1 million home and the luxury vehicle and like all kinds of perks or reimbursements. Like, yes, you could reasonably do all of that as part of compensation, but you're not going to be able to include things like a standard company car, healthcare, like childcare. All of that is like, it's not usually going to rise to the level that it's impressive enough to be able to make the total significantly higher remuneration argument. So I actually have not done this in the past. I've considered doing it in a couple cases, but I have not ended up doing it. I just didn't feel that it was a good idea.
How do you calculate 90th percentile? Especially, I'm in Canada and pretty sure it is above 95% in Canada, but not in the US.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the salary data should be locally placed. You don't need to prove that you're making the 90th percentile in a US salary if you're in a country with significantly lower salaries. Like, I will work with people in Indonesia, Nigeria, like all over the world where salaries are significantly low. Like, the person might be making $20,000 US, and it is a huge salary in that part of the world. That's fine. It only needs to be a high salary in relation to others in the field, like within the geographic area. So I've definitely claimed high salary in those scenarios, and it has worked. Both of the cases that I'm citing here, though, had major benefits in that they had a U.S. job offer already, and the U.S. job offer had a significantly high salary as well. So even though most of our analysis was on the foreign salaries, there wasn't really a reason for USCIS to question it because they had the high salary in the U.S. I don't think you need that. I think you could do the analysis just based on the foreign salary. You would need to pull in some local salary benchmarking reports that justify that you're in the 95th percentile here. But yeah, I'm curious to see how USCIS would handle, and they probably aren't consistent in how they handle every case that only claims the foreign salary. For Canada, I think it's probably pretty reasonable. So I'm not as concerned about claiming the high salary in Canada versus the high salary in, for example, Nigeria or Indonesia, just because there's a smaller discrepancy between Canada and the US. And so USCIS isn't going to really have qualms about approving that. But yeah, you have to make an argument with the data that you have, and you have to justify it. So bring in some professional salary reports to show it.
Should we consider salary in the locality or a national average?
Yeah, good question. There's also not a requirement in the regulations that you do one or the other. I like to include both whenever possible. You can show that it's both local and national, that's even better. If I have a case and every single time I'm looking up salary benchmarking, no matter what the measure is, it meets the benchmark, I'm going to put in all of those documents as evidence. I'm going to say this works locally, this works nationally, this works under this category, this SOC code, this other SOC code. I'm going to say it's worldwide within the highest in the field. Like, I'm going to say everything that is relevant. There are some cases that I filed where the person didn't meet the salary locally, like San Francisco salary, but they did meet it nationally at the 90th percentile, and I still argued that. I don't know for sure if it was successful. Like with other criteria, we don't often know exactly what persuaded USCIS and exactly what criteria were won. But you can make an argument based on the national, and sometimes USCIS will consider it.
India?
So I think this is asking if you can use like salary reports from India to show your Indian salary is high, and yes, you definitely can. Just like with any other country. Most of the cases I've handled, if not all, like I don't think I've ever actually put in a salary report from India, because we could always show that the person had the really, really high U.S. job offer, and usually the person was already working in that U.S. job. But yes, you can benchmark according to the nation that you are working in. And some people like to show a sustained high salary, so you can show high salary in the US for the last 2 years, high salary in India for 5 years before, high salary in another country for 2 years before. That can work well.
Avinash asks, when adjudicating for high salary criteria, do they verify it through the SOC tied to your visa?
So the SOC code isn't something that the government makes a determination on. The employer has to kind of self-select it when filing the LCA application. Since they're self-selecting it, like it's probably accurate. Companies usually pick an accurate code, but for a lot of occupations, there are 2, 3, 4 codes that are roughly the same in accuracy. And that's just because the Department of Labor is very slow in updating the kinds of occupations that it surveys. So no, you can always file an EB-1A case or any other self-petition case with a different SOC code than the one that's on your H-1B. It just has to make sense, and I generally avoid picking an SOC code with a lower salary than the one that's tied to your visa. Usually when I'm filing EB-1As or NIWs, I'm actually picking an SOC code that's higher than the one tied to the visa. Like higher level, higher job zone requires more qualifications, has a more impressive sounding like managerial title and that kind of thing. You always want to bump it up so that you can show that not only are you bumping up the classification, but that within that classification you also earn a high salary. But this is never verified at all. The SOC system and its application is very informal.
Pankaj asks, how many years of W-2 are submitted to prove consistent high salary?
So you actually don't need to prove consistent high salary at all. A real bona fide job offer, even where you haven't earned that high salary yet, will meet the requirements of the regulation on its own. So when looking at final merits and sustained a claim, sometimes it's nice to be able to show you have always been highly compensated or at least been compensated for several years. So in many cases, I do include, 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 years of W-2s to show the consistent high payments, high salary, but there's no requirement. And in many cases, I end up just showing one or showing none and just showing the job offer letter.
Selfaraj asks, which websites materials USCIS usually likely to consider to benchmark local national average salary for specified roles, especially for applicants from outside US?
The only standard report that USCIS uses is the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics. They don't have a list of standard reports for salaries in India or salaries in China or salaries in Nigeria or salaries in Brazil or anything like that. There are various professional international salary benchmarking companies that can come into play here. Usually they're with firms like Robert Half or something like that. So those reports can be very informative and influential. Sometimes there are more local salary survey companies. Sometimes you can get an expert letter from like a headhunting agency. There's lots of different ways to research the salary benchmarks and provide documentation that is professional and legitimate. There's also websites you can use salary.com, Salary Explorer. There's all kinds now that kind of crowdsource these salaries and try to give accurate pictures of what people are making. They're a little bit lesser value because they're not professionally surveyed and people do need to self-report where their salaries are not necessarily being verified, but they can be useful, especially if they are supporting what a more professional evaluation is saying.
Punjali asks, does applying outside US decrease your chances of being approved for an EB-1A?
I don't think that's the real factor. So maybe it's harder to get approved if you are outside the US, but I don't think that the fact that you are outside the US really weighs into the analysis there. It's just more about showing activities and opportunities that the USCIS officer might be familiar with. For example, Chinese EB-1As versus EB-1As for people from China who have been in the US for 5 years. The Chinese EB-1As, they usually publish in Chinese-only journals that really aren't available or are available on a limited basis in the US. So USCIS might have a bit more scrutiny on them because they just don't know about the journal. Whereas Chinese scholars who have been here in the US and are publishing in either US-based or international and internationally available journals have that level of familiarity built in, and there's a little bit more trust in the source. So it can matter a little bit. It's not supposed to matter. A lot will depend on how you present the evidence and how you qualify the evidence, how you show that it is legitimate. But yeah, I also don't know if USCIS has released data on this. That would actually be interesting to look into. So maybe I will see what's out there when I do my next data analysis.
So I got a message through direct messages. Someone asked, should salary comparison be made against job title or functional working title against salary on Glassdoor or salary.com or payscale.com? Sometimes companies has job title different than functional working title.
Either one is totally fine. Like sometimes a different job title and the description of duties that go along with that title is more accurate to your job than an exact match on job title. USCIS might look at discrepancies, but often when I'm putting in salary reports, I am putting in reports with multiple different similar job titles and not titles that have an exact match. You have to be reasonable in what you're doing. It has to make sense. It all has to be high level. And just keep in mind that USCIS, they can also go in and look at these websites. And so if they think you're using the wrong one, they can call you out. But yeah, I'm not usually looking at exact matches because that's not really how salary surveys work in the real world.
Charlie asks, can a candidate on day one CPT apply for a 1 or EB-1A?
Yeah, totally fine. I've handled those cases before. There might be a slight bias depending on the program, depending on where you're at, depending on how long you've been in CPT. Like you do need to show sustained a claim. And so if you are on CPT and you're working, say, as like a standard software engineer at a good sized company in the US, that might be looked at with a degree of skepticism. But if you're on day one CPT and you're an operations manager at a big company and you have a long career with some claim, it should be just fine.
I am a little short for national, less than 3K, but for 90%, but way ahead on local. Is it a good idea to claim or skip?
You can claim it. I work with people all the time, for example, software engineering managers who work in Kansas or Wyoming or states that have very sparse population and very low wages compared to the rest of the country. The national average is definitely pumped up by the Bay Area and New York and DC and all the big major metropolitan areas. So a lot of them don't meet the national 90th percentile, but locally they're making far and above the 90th percentile. So I do claim the high salary argument in those cases. And I do think it's been successful. Again, I'm never sure what the reason for success on an EB-1A is, but I do think it's a strong argument to claim the state or the local salary.
How many years of Wait, no, this was already asked.
We answered that one.
Sage Guru Data asks, some tech roles in specific domains like healthcare tend to pay slightly less compared to tech companies. In such cases, how can one demonstrate a high salary? For instance, if a high salary is considered top 1% based on the local zip code, but lower when compared to the national average, would that be acceptable?
I've never really gone so local as a zip code. I would be a bit hesitant on that. Usually the Bureau of Labor Statistics is looking at metropolitan areas and reporting on like the general area, and I would rather go off of that. Also, you can make an argument within industry or domain, but it's not guaranteed to be accepted. I have done a little bit more of a deep dive on that using the Department of Labor's data, and I have shown in some cases that the person was making 90th percentile in their specific industry, but I didn't feel super confident about that argument. Like it's much better if you can just show high salary and you're not trying to make a super complicated argument about that, because then USCIS will just pretty much accept it. But the more qualifications you're adding to the salary argument, the more detail you're adding, I think the more likely it is to be questioned. Because you can slice and dice the data anyway. Like, you can move to a different zip code and then claim high salary, and it's just, I don't love it. I don't love getting that deep into the numbers. I don't think USCIS usually goes for it.
All right, just a couple more questions. Ram asks, hi Amber, good morning. Do you help with RFE cases response?
So sometimes yes, but at the moment I cannot take RFE cases. We had a flood of NIW RFEs come in, and so we have a lot of deadlines. We have to make sure that we meet those deadlines. So I'm not taking any RFEs right now.
Gban asks, sorry if I missed, how high the salary should be in percentage compared to the industry benchmark?
Usually about 90th percentile is what you want to show, 90th or higher.
If the I-140 is already approved and we want to utilize the existing priority date, is it necessary to have the same SOC, standard occupational classification code, for the high salary position?
No, but it is worth considering. You do need to prove that it is in the same or a similar occupation. SOC code's also updated recently, or relatively recently, so sometimes using the same code is not possible. They reshuffled some occupations, so you don't need to be like super legalistic about it, but you need to be reasonable and make sense.
Marshall asks, so we can high salary plus bonus, from count salary plus bonus to make an argument, or is it just base?
You can make an argument either way, but base is the safer argument and the one that USCIS is more likely to accept.
I'll ask current question. I'm seeing that with the potential immigration bans that are anticipated, can someone still apply for employment-based visas?
Yes, although we don't know for sure how that's going to look at the consulates for employment-based visas. I would definitely recommend that anyone in countries that are being considered for the travel ban, if they are in the U.S., to stay in the U.S. If they're outside the U.S., to come to the U.S. quickly, and not to make travel plans, because we're not sure exactly how the consulates are going to handle that or the scope of the bans.
Right, Madhu, last question. Should it be above 500K for Bay Area?
So for total comp in the Bay Area, I'm usually looking at above 500 as the benchmark. For high salary, it depends on the occupation. For software engineer, software developer, that kind of role, it's usually above 240 as base.
Great. Anything else you want to cover?
Nope, that sounds good.
Right. Thanks everyone.